69% of refugees originate from 5 countries. Syrian Arabs are 6.8 million, Venezuelans are 4.6 million, Afghanistan's are 2.7 million, South Sudan 2.4 million, and Myanmar are 1.2 million. That's where most of the refugees come from. The 38% are hosted in just 5 countries. They are Turkey, who took in 3.8 million, Colombia 1.8 million, Uganda 1.5 million, Pakistan 1.5 million, and Germany 1.3 million. 36.5 million are children. These are people under the age of 18. 83% of the refugees are hosted in low to middle income countries. 72% of the refugees live in countries neighboring their countries of origin. And then, just for interest, some famous refugees are Albert Einstein, Gloria Estefan, Sigmund Freud, Billy Wilder, and Madeleine Albright. Who knew? Interestingly enough, the word refugee first came from Protestants, white Protestants, that were trying to get away from King Louis XIV. And they were fleeing for religious persecution. They were the Huguenots, and they were over in France, trying to get away from King Louis. And there's a difference between a migrant and an immigrant. These are people that move from one place to, they are the same, sorry. Migrants and immigrants are the same. And they are people that voluntarily move. So I am an immigrant to Texas. I voluntarily moved from Arizona. All right? A refugee and an asylum seeker are people that have left their country because of persecution, war, or violence. And so that's the difference. They're 2 different things. So not all immigrants are refugees, but all refugees are immigrants, if that makes sense. Okay, so Jesus then is in the borderlands. So Jesus is with all of these people, and it's not it makes perfect sense that when you look at a map and see where Christianity is growing the most, it's growing the most in Africa. Africa consistently has the most people that are converting over to Christianity. And because it's an incredibly war-torn country, it makes perfect reason that that would happen, because I don't know what it is about us humans, but we have to lose everything before we start looking for God and realize we can't do it by ourselves. So when people have lost everything, they're looking for something. They're looking for something to fill that God hole that we've talked about before. And so God goes into these places by means of people just like us that deliver the word of Jesus Christ and say there is something for you out there in the refugee world. So that's globally. So if we talk in smaller people-to-people things, back in the 80s and 90s, the big thing here in the United States of people that were put on the margins were people that tested positive with HIV. And like leprosy, people didn't understand how you got it, and they were afraid if you had it, that they might get it, because we just didn't understand. And so they wanted to take people with HIV and they wanted to push them away. My younger brother, when he was 18, he was diagnosed with HIV. And he lived with it from the time he was 18 until he was 33. And he was going to come home for Christmas one year, and he lived in Dallas. And he got on a plane in Dallas, and he had to change planes in Covington, Kentucky, which supposedly is the Cincinnati airport. But it's not in Cincinnati, Ohio at all. It's in Covington, Kentucky. So they landed in the Cincinnati airport, and he had passed out on the airplane, and so they took him off the airplane and they took him to the hospital. So Danny goes, my husband goes to pick him up, and he doesn't get off the plane. We were living in Raleigh at the time. He didn't get off the plane, he didn't get off the plane, he didn't get off the plane. So we had to call him, we had to find out where he was. At this point, cell phones were real expensive. Most people didn't have them, so you just really had to use the house phone and figure out where it was. And we kept saying, they kept telling us he got taken off in the Ohio airport. But at that point, we didn't know that the Ohio airport was in Covington, Kentucky. So it took us a while to figure out where he was, and he had a really high fever, and we were able to talk to him briefly. And he said, they'll let me get on the next plane if I can get my fever down. And we're like, okay, this is the 23rd of December. So the 24th of December comes, and they're still keeping him. So we said, that's okay, we want you to come. Well, sometime on the 25th, he lapsed into a coma. So the 26th, we put my mom on an airplane. We flew her. This time we knew she was going to Covington, Kentucky. Flew her there. She got off and she stayed with him. And if you remember New Year's Eve of 1999, they were afraid that all of the computers were going to shut down. So she spent the night right beside him because he was on a ventilator. And the doctor goes, you really need to go home. And she goes, no, what if the ventilator stops? And he goes, and what, ma'am, are you going to do if that ventilator stops? And she said, I can yell. And he said, all right, fair enough. So the computers did not go down, and his respirator did not stop, but it was obvious that he wasn't going to make it any longer. So my sister and her husband left from Arkansas to go to meet in Kentucky, and Danny and I left from Raleigh to meet in Kentucky. And we got there. We had been driving for 2 days. And we got there and we walked into the hospital, and he was in ICU, so we could only see him for a short amount of time. And we were all meeting in the ICU room and talking, and all of a sudden you could see people chattering. And you could hear them, and they're going, those are the family of that boy that's dying of AIDS. And you could see groups getting up and going to the nurse's station and saying, where can we sit so we don't have to breathe the same air they do? Never in my life have I felt so marginalized. But I wasn't there for me. I was there for my brother. So we had the whole waiting room to ourselves by the end of it. And everybody was talking. So we went back to see him for the first time. And they had the windows wide open, the curtains wide open, and the sun was coming right in on him, and they had him sitting up straight, and he was hunched over like this, and he had the breathing tubes, and he could just barely breathe, and it was just horrific. And there was no music, no television on, no nothing. And it was like, what's going on here? He's not dead yet. Let's treat him like he's human. And so we called the nurse in there, and it was obvious she didn't want to be there, and she didn't care because he had AIDS. So we left, and we came back that next night, and they had changed nursing staff. And this nurse cared. So nurses, you make a difference. They had put the bed down. They put extra pillows behind his neck. They had only the dim light here on. They had all of the other lights down. And you'd really have to know my little brother, except the fact that he was gay, and so this kind of goes that way. They had Gloria Estefan playing on the recorder, but they had gone to find one that they could play the cassettes on because that's what he had in his luggage. And he was so peaceful at that point in time. But still, when we walked in the waiting room, everybody else made sure that they went to the next one. So the next day we went in, and it was the day we talked to the doctors, and it was obvious that we needed to unplug all the machines and everything like that. And the reason I share this with you is I know I'm not the only person that's ever lost someone that they love, but that was the first time I had ever felt the marginalization brought on by ignorance. It was just ignorance. He was a human being, and he was a computer specialist. He was incredibly smart, but people just didn't understand. But Jesus was there in the margins. And that's where we find Jesus, in the margins. We find Jesus with the refugees. We find Jesus with the AIDS patients. If you remember when COVID first started, it was the same way. People, if they thought you might even have COVID, they tried to get you out of there. My son is a pastor in North Carolina, and they had a case that came from the original one in Washington State. One of their parishioners' brothers was dying in Washington State, so he went up there. He ended up getting COVID from that nursing home that had the first case, came back. They couldn't let anybody know because they had newspaper reporters and the other people from television right there trying to figure out who it was so they could go camp out on this guy's front yard, and he had just lost his brother. We do this. We want to marginalize people, and it's all out of fear, but that's where God is. God meets us. So we have these lepers. We have 10 of them. And they are far, far away, and they're calling out to Jesus. And Jesus walks up to them, and he says, all you have to do is go to the priest, and the priest will make you well. And the 10 of them went. Now, can you imagine being that sick coming back? What do you think the first thing you would do? I would imagine it would be to go tell my family that I was well now. To look and say, look at me. But one of them came back. And one of them said, thank you. And Jesus said, your faith has made you well. Now, when you think about it, all 10 of them were saved. All 10 of them were well. So what's the difference in that one that came back? What's interesting is the word that's used can be healed, used as healed. It can mean healed or it can be saved. So they were all healed. They were all saved. But the difference is when you go through something really horrible and you get to the other side and you can look back and see that Jesus was there all the time, that you were not alone when you thought you were, when you can finally feel that peace that passes all understanding, that goes, Jesus was there. It gives you a feeling like nothing else. And you can notice people that have had these tragedies, that have come out the other side, because they are the people when bad things happen and most of the world is falling apart, that have this inner serenity that just go, we'll get through this too. And there's quite a few of you in the room that can do that have been there and done that. And that's the healing that one Samaritan had. He could come back and say thank you because he saw that by having leprosy, his life was changed, but he saw the gratitude in it. He saw the mercy in it. He saw that being changed through that was not an altogether bad thing. So yeah, if we put a Band-Aid on it, it's really not going to make that big a difference. In the short term it does, especially if you get a kiss from someone you love a whole lot right beside it. But to go through the really, really tough times and to be able to look back on them and say, that's where God was. That's what really makes you well. It's called faith. And it's one of those things that's down deep inside, and it restructures your whole world. And it makes you a better person. And it gives you the opportunity to go out and make the world a better person. And you're going to find a lot of people like that in the refugee camps because they have been to hell and back. And you're going to find those people in the AIDS wards who have lost people and have been ostracized. And you're going to find them other places, even in Memorial Lutheran and First Presbyterian Church. So my brothers and sisters, I'm not giving you a Band-Aid today. I'm giving you Jesus Christ, who will make you well from whatever it is that you're hurting with. And all God's people say, amen.